The big thing for me is if you're heading into a podcast episode with that ideal guest profile, don't just ask them about themselves and what they do, but try and figure out a problem that they deal with, a conflict that they experience, and how they've been able to overcome it.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. My least favorite way a podcast can start is to ask the question, so tell the audience about yourself, or something along those lines. It's because I hear all the time how B2B podcasts are boring, but I disagree with that premise. The reason that B2B podcasts can be boring isn't because they don't have some kitschy little thing at the beginning. It's because they aren't designed to actually help the audience. Instead of revolving around some sort of problem or solution, they revolve around telling about the guest's background and what they're up to, what company they work for, so on and so forth. The issue with that is that when you're just focused on a guest telling about themselves, sure, they might be in your space, which is great, and they might relate to your audience, which is also great. But the problem is that you're really hoping that the guest is going to provide the interesting aspects of the show. And I personally don't ever want to have to rely on my guest to be the one that makes the show interesting. If I'm focused on that, I'm going to be worried heading in about the show actually being interesting because I'm not going to know if they're going to actually relate to my audience and tell stories that matter. So without burying the lead any further on this podcast episode today, what I want to talk about is the ways to make your show interesting for a guest-based interview, but being able to take that power back for yourself. And for me, the way that I personally do it is that I try to start my episodes with conflict or a problem. So what I want to do today is I want to go through some examples of how I do that. So let's start with this show. This show is a B2B tech marketing podcast that helps small marketing teams of 1 to 5 figure out how to execute on a podcast. And my typical interview is going to be of a B2B podcaster. That's my most typical interview. And that is also my most typical audience. And I've interviewed a lot of B2B podcasters, but what I don't do anymore is just say, okay, B2B podcaster, tell me about what it's like to be a B2B podcaster. You know, what do you experience? How do you do your repurposed content? And then, then I go on with an interview and they tell me whatever they tell me. And the story is very similar each time. Instead, what I do either on a pre-call or a pre-eval of a guest is that I ask them or I think about how they specifically can help my audience. This is going to help me come up with my problem. An example is I was working with a CMO who's like a 2-person marketing team, and I thought that I was going to tackle the topic of how to seem bigger than you are or have a great content strategy through your podcast with a small team. And she told me, no, the problem that her podcast has really solved for her is getting a pulse on her industry by having a weekly show. She was able to understand really in depth her ideal customer profile better than she ever was before. So the problem that I was able to outline was marketers understanding their ideal customer profile and how this person solved that problem and executed and succeeded by having their B2B podcast. So here are some other examples of problems that I've tackled on our show by talking to B2B podcasters about more than just them having a podcast. The problem of executives having to be the hosts of the show and the difficulty of tracking down their calendars along with guest calendars and how marketers are overcoming that. You see, I'm always kind of setting up a problem and solution to kind of see how I could do, hey, you're a B2B podcaster, tell me about your show, tell me about what you're experiencing, how are you using it? But instead, I try to tackle that specific problem. Another example is I brought someone on who's in the very fast-moving financial space and how they balance evergreen content with the very timely financial content that they go through. I start off my interviews with a little background and hello and welcome to the show, and my first question then goes right in. So for that question in this episode about the financial space, my first question was, Okay, so you're in the business, tax, and finance space, but specifically the finance and stock side of things. You do episodes on crypto, the stock market, etc. Those spaces change literally by the minute, by the hour, by the day. What is it like having to stay timely with your content so that it still resonates with your audience when you release it? And I ask this type of question for two reasons. One is I know that it will actually help my audience. And two is that it makes it interesting. And this goes back to the whole issue of, is B2B podcast content interesting, entertaining, what have you? Look, I'm not going to entertain you usually by making you laugh. I mean, I guess I'm kind of a funny guy in my personal life to an extent, but my podcast isn't going to make you laugh. It's not going to make you cry. But where it's going to be interesting is that I tackle problems and conflicts that other B2B podcasters are experiencing, and then I give solutions on what they're doing about it. Once we spend some time going through this main core conflict, I may then broaden out my questions and start to ask those things like, how did you get into B2B podcasting? What tangible results have you experienced? What KPIs do you track? Downloads matter. What are you doing for repurposed content? There's so many questions that I could ask for more generic questions that could go to any B2B podcaster. But if I ask that in every interview at the very beginning, I would very quickly bore my audience. So instead, I start with that conflict. I use something that's very interesting to the audience up front, and they say, wow, I'm actually really interested in hearing more about this. And then from there, I can go a little bit more broad because I've already captured their attention up front. I've made it entertaining. The content is relevant. And then over time, we can go down whatever pathway we want. But I feel more confident going in with the subject matter that is more interesting and will help get the audience engaged at the very beginning of that episode. So just for fun, I'll give a couple more examples on how I use problems to set up episodes. So another example of a problem is it's hard to execute on a B2B podcast on a small team. So I interviewed someone who on a small team was able to get to 100 podcast episodes. Another thing that B2B podcasters and B2B marketers struggle with is YouTube. So I'm going to interview someone, and I have, on how they were able to overcome the hurdle of YouTube to get thousands of views on their podcast on YouTube. I'm always looking at problems, the YouTube problem, the small team problem. Here's another one, how a marketer was able to run 3 podcasts at a tech company. The problem is they're strapped for time. They're dealing with lots of people, a handful of podcasts, lots of repurposed content, and how she was able to get all of that out and published every single week. So to wrap up here, the big thing for me is if you're heading into a podcast episode with that ideal guest profile that usually is both your guest and your listener or audience, don't just ask them about themselves and what they do, but try and figure out a problem that they deal with, a conflict that they experience, and how they've been able to overcome it. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Recorded Content.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.